Welcome everyone to the session 3 in our 3-part series for food safety webinar. This one's about the challenge of media and communicating food safety with Dr. Darin Detwiler. See if I can get my screen started today. We're going to do a little bit of housekeeping, and this might be a bit repetitive for people that have come to the other two, but your audio and video is turned off. If you want to ask a question, please do. You can either use the chat function or the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring those throughout the session, and we'll address those at the end of the session today. If you're not familiar with Perennia, our vision is to be a recognized world leader in producing innovative, environmentally responsible, safe food of impeccable quality for Nova Scotia. Our mission is supporting growth, transformation, and economic development in Nova Scotia's agriculture, seafood, and food and beverage sectors. Our service areas are agriculture, quality and food safety, product development, lab services, and fisheries. I'd like to remind everybody of the Minister of Agriculture digital series that's happening throughout the next couple of months. Please visit our website to register. I'd like to introduce Dr. Darin Detwiler, founder and CEO of Detwiler Consulting Group. He's internationally recognized, respected food policy expert with over 25 years experience in shaping federal food policy. He's the assistant dean at Northeastern University's College of Professional Studies and the lead faculty of Regulatory Affairs of Food Program. I guess you can share your screen now and I'll stop sharing mine.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'll bring up my screen here. Hold on. It's always a couple clicks away. We're going to look at the challenge of media and communicating food safety. So with this, let's really quickly look at, I'm not going to get too deep into this, but this idea of we've had these industrial revolutions I talked about in my last presentation. The first one being literally when we look at the idea of having industry, but the second one was when we were starting to really start mechanizing and consolidating and concentrating and mass producing everything. We're talking about 100 years ago, the beginning of the 20th century. And with this, we also had population moving to more urban, we had immigration, we had industrialization and imperialization. And all these were starting to really come together and create scenarios with our food. Right off the bat, here, this is from 1884. From a magazine called Puck, the first successful U.S. humor magazine, which covered presidential politics and social issues of the day. It was noted for its colorful covers and detailed cartoons, caricatures, and political satire. You can see here this idea from 1884, look before you eat and see if you can discover any unadulterated food, implying that more food was adulterated than not. They're also making it look as if it's you have to have a high level of technical equipment and perhaps education in order to be able to look at this for yourself. During the same period of time in 1906, we started to see some other similar artwork in the magazine. The meat market, looking at the idea of, is it processed? Is it deodorized? Is it, you know, what kind of chemicals are added to it? And Watch the Professor, the idea of packing town, saying that it's pure, but what you don't see too clearly there is that they're putting a lot of stuff that's not pure and then packaging it as pure meat products. But we also know from 1906, we have Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Now, The Jungle actually didn't start out as the book, The Jungle. It started out as a series of articles in a newspaper called Appeal to Reason. And Upton Sinclair actually went undercover as someone who worked in the Chicago meat slaughterhouses, meat packing industry. And he was really just trying to get background information for his main character, but he ended up seeing so much of what was going on in terms of literally food would fall onto the the facility's floor, and they would just pick it up. They would sweep dirt and dust and hair and debris into it, and it's, just pack it all in and can it and call it what it was instead of actually dealing with it. So, with the publication of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle came this 1906 literary review from the London Times. And what's notable about this review is this one passage where the reviewer says, "It is with nothing less than horror that we learn it to be true. The things described by Mr. Sinclair happened yesterday, are happening today, and will happen tomorrow and the next day until some Hercules comes to cleanse the filthy stable." So here we have the idea of the literature world intersecting with this unfolding investigation. Now, we also know that this is part of this bigger meat scandal where President Roosevelt, as the story goes, was eating sausages one morning, was made aware of the work going on. And he even called together his own team to investigate what was going on in Packingtown. And his team, as we now know, verified everything that was said by and described by Upton Sinclair. So here we were where communication, we see this in magazines or newspapers and in books, were resulting in changes in law and policy regarding food safety. We have the beginning of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, but none of this would have gained the momentum that it needed in order to bring about these changes if it wasn't for the public support. And this public support came through the communication. But we need to also look at communication in terms of how journalism works. So we can see here, this is the New York Times, June 8th, 1906, and it's talking about the political work in Congress to bring about the Pure Food Bill, which would become the Pure Food and Drug Act. So you can see I've highlighted it in yellow. Here's this article. But what's important to note is that on the very next page, literally you open up the newspaper and what you saw before was on the left. Now what you're seeing is on the right. Now on the left, I magnified where it says the Pure Food Bill. That's what it shows there in yellow. But I did not magnify what it shows here on the right, this open letter to President Roosevelt and the American nation. Let's explore this a little bit. This is, here we go. This is an open letter. It's an ad. You can see it's as tall as the page, and it takes up what, 1, 2, 3, 4 columns out of 7 in the paper here. The Franco-American Food Company, we're very familiar, most of us, with SpaghettiOs, even though now SpaghettiOs is technically owned by Campbell, but they still use the Franco-American label. Packers of honestly and cleanly made canned soups, potted beef, broths, pudding, etc. But what this article boils down to is 3 key lines. Again, talking to President Roosevelt and communicating this to the public. The first one, the report of your commissioners, that's that special group that the president had go to verify what was going on, as described by Upton Sinclair. The report of your commissioners on the packing industry of Chicago is being published and commented upon by the press of this country, also by newspapers throughout the world. So looking at the magnitude of this. It follows up with, we regret that if you feel confident the report of your commissioners is true, you did not make the investigation more thorough. Again, this is a food company in an open letter published in the New York Times talking to the president. Finally, the company states, these are some of the reasons why we consider the commissioner's statements incomplete. So they don't say wrong, but they say incomplete. So here we have opposing arguments to this idea of the work that's going on to just make our food pure. Again, not just by the Franco-American Food Company, but in even larger font, the packers of honestly and cleanly made food products. So interesting strategy here. But I want to point out that there's also this image used of a woman, kind of like a chef. We see this. You can see here in the bottom left. This is actually a trading card that uses the same idea of young, of vulnerable and honest and clean and angelic. And Franco-American's not alone in this. Campbell's, who now owns SpaghettiOs, Campbell's has been doing the same exact thing. This idea of the innocent, clean, the white clothing kind of a thing. How can they be anything other than honest and clean, right? If we take it even further, Swift Company, this is a maker of meats. It's a little hard to believe this, like you would not see this today, but back in 1903, in that area, about over 100 years ago, people would actually go and visit these plants, and they would actually be handed a visitor's reference book that would kind of describe what they're looking at different stations. Station 2 is for pork cutting, station or whatever that station number is for beginning hog dressing. But what's interesting of note is kind of like what you saw with Franco-American, with Campbell's, is this inclusion of this, and many times a floating cherub-like young character that was almost acting as if it's the narrative pointing out this. And notice too the images of the visitors. They're dressed to the nines in top hats and monocles and fancy dresses, really kind of saying that this is so clean and so honest, that you could dress up like this and it's appropriate. Whereas it's interesting how when the literature review described Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, states that the descriptions in the book were unfit for females. It was unfit for the common, the average reader kind of a thing. So again, we can look at what was going on with the second industrial revolution and say, well, what about the third industrial revolution? Which obviously we can look at the idea of the time period around 100 years later, still going on to some extent right now, but it's really anchored by the Jack-in-the-Box landmark Jack-in-the-Box E. coli outbreak of 1993. This is being talked about, this has long been talked about in terms of impacting um, um, our current food safety culture, if you will. So let's explore this. So the Jack-in-the-Box outbreak in 1993 was a multi-state E. coli outbreak, sickening over 750 across 4 states, hospitalizing over 100, and resulting in the deaths of 4 toddlers. I talk about this to a great extent in my book on food safety. And specifically, I also talk about the 4th and final child to die, who was my son, Riley Detwiler. And Riley, there's a lot that could be said about this, but one thing that became interesting is that Riley was the first person, and this was something that I was only able to find out about 5 years ago. Riley was the first person, the first name actually listed in newspapers in the New York Times as a person having died from E. coli in terms of national headlines. But let's explore that. We have numerous examples of newspapers from this period of time. And I will note that, especially for younger participants here, it's actually harder to find articles online before 1998, and this took place 3 years before. But there are a good number of examples of articles and headlines and images from this period of time. But they're not all the same. Let's take a look at what I mean by that. So some of them talk about the idea of the burgers, outbreak, inspection, Jack-in-the-Box, food, bacteria, meat, tainted, hamburger, uh, President Clinton, illness, child dies. Talk about companies like Foodmaker, Vaughn's, Jack in the Box, um, things of that nature. They talk about sales. They talk about standards and agriculture and things of that nature. USDA. Others talk about, again, I'm not trying to say there's a problem with journalists. I'm just saying when you really look at it, now other newspapers talk about toddler, E. coli, boy, Detwiler, Riley Detwiler, pledges, parents, cases awareness, parents, support family life, fear, community health, sickness, death, losses, turn for the worse, infection, families, kids, scary, community, children, words that are vastly different than other newspapers. And this is what I want to explore. So on the left, we see keywords from headlines of national newspapers, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post. Whereas on the right, we see keywords from headlines of state and local papers where the majority of these infections, these outbreaks, these illnesses and deaths were taking place at the time. So, breaking this down, what we see is in these speaker bubbles, if you will, the larger the font means the more often it was found and more frequent the words are found in the headlines, again, of either national newspapers on the left or state and local newspapers on the right. The national newspapers focus on names of companies. They were vague or used generic terms. They focus on economics and politics, where, again, on the state and local papers on the right, they focused on victims, community, public health, and even the true burden of disease. If not calling it out deliberately, at least using words that could be characterized as part of the true burden of disease. Even local TV news coverage was quite jarring at the time. This was images into people's homes about what was going on with this. Children being evacuated by helicopters to hospitals, images from inside the hospitals showing families, showing very young children, and even showing just how grave this was. We must note that during this time, major fast food burger chains, not just Jack in the Box, but other competitors, were threatening to pull their advertising from the TV news shows if the focus on this outbreak and the aftermath continued. This was hurting not only the specific restaurant at the heart of this outbreak, but it was impacting other fast food restaurants, not even just hamburger restaurants at the time. Um, Beyond newspapers, beyond television, I was caught off guard when I saw an image in 1993 after my son's funeral. Uh, we didn't have the internet back then. We didn't have memes and viral things of that nature. But to see a T-shirt that said "crap in the box," um, indicating the idea of this awareness that Jack in the Box was associated with E. coli. E. coli was associated with fecal contamination. That caught me off guard, and my view on it then is a little different than my view on it now. And I'll come back to that in a minute. There were some other things, some other images, postcards. You see a very colorful postcard on the left. The USDA sent out these postcards to school children through the National Nurse Association. This idea of what can we do right away? The idea of make sure it's brown in the middle, recipe for a safe and delicious hamburger. They weren't saying that there was anything wrong. They just wanted to make sure that people were cooking their hamburgers safely. We also eventually got the USDA safe handling instructions. Again, no indication of what exactly is wrong, but it may contain bacteria that could cause illness, really kind of contained the severity there. And this is where, again, keep refrigerated, wash your hands, cook thoroughly, keep hot food's hot, refrigerate leftovers, immediately discard. This label has been mandatory for over 26 years now on all packages of raw meat and poultry sold in the U.S. So let's look at journalism. And what I'm going to talk about here, again, I really want to make sure that the audience understands that I'm not saying that there are problems with journalism. I think we just have to understand some of the forces with journalism. Elaine, can you hear me? I was going to ask you a question here.
Sure.
Elaine, when you're thinking about the news, who would cover, if you think about a newsroom on television or a newspaper, what kind of a reporter do you think would cover a fast food, or I'm sorry, a foodborne illness outbreak?
I guess it would depend on where it is. I mean, locally, I'm sure they would put the top news people on. I mean, I imagine.
Well, but we know it. We know it's not going to be the sports department.
No.
They specialized, right?
Yeah.
It's probably not going to be weather, if there's, the weather meteorologist, I guess, like on television. But I think that we need to think about how some people are going to be more aligned to this. But when we look at food today, there's many different overlapping areas of focus. So we're going to take a look at this. And Elaine, I'll call you back in a few minutes to ask you another couple questions here.
Sounds good.
But let's start off with ideology. We know that there's bias. We know that some news organizations are more liberal, some are more conservative, some are purely sports, some are purely religious, some are purely entertainment, right? So that's going to be one factor in terms of not only if they're going to cover this issue, does it rise to that level of them covering it, but how are they going to cover it? Another area we have to be concerned about is the idea of extra media forces. Economics and technology has played a significant role in newspapers that have been consolidated, newspapers that have been just shut down, or they've shifted to purely online, and how that works. We also got to look at the idea of how a newspaper is organized, kind of like what we were talking about here. Is it the food desk? Is it the crime desk that would cover this issue? Is it a business desk? Who would best cover this? Is it the national desk if it's a national issue? Oops, where are we? We could also look at, I think I went too far. We could also look at the fact that journalists, we don't have the same number in the US, at least, of journalists who are specifically trained, and their specific area of coverage is on food. In the work I was doing to put together my book, not only did I find out that so many of them have left or have been fired or have been repurposed, but in the United States, and Elaine, I'll come back to you on this. Elaine, how many journalists would you assume specifically focus on food policy and food safety? That's the only thing they really cover.
I would say less than 5, I would think. I don't think anybody locally does, unless they have, some local cook on for an entertainment type of situation or whatever. But
right. Well, see, that's what's interesting too. First off, you're right. It's about 4 or 5.
Yeah.
Based on the interviews that I've done with those 4 or 5 people, and with people who head up journalism pieces. But they also brought up the idea that we have a confusion. I'm glad you use this word. There's the celebrity food people, right? There's those celebrity chefs. And if anything, most of the time on television, we'll see those celebrity chefs brought in, and yet celebrity chefs, they don't necessarily know or have anything to do when it comes to policy and food safety. In fact, many times you look at, there's actually research out there, international and US research, that has looking at some of these cooking shows, how many times they either missed an opportunity to show a safe food handling or a safety a step that we talk about, or that they actually did something wrong, kind of a thing.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
like they were not washing their hands, they were cross-contaminating, they were not using thermometers, things of that nature. So that really kind of puts a different spin on this idea of who's a journalist, or who is a celebrity, or who's a real chef that really is a strong voice in this area. Becomes quite complicated there, because in many people's eyes, they're all one and the same. But let's keep looking at this. When we look at the idea of Archie Carroll's pyramid of corporate social responsibility, we see there's a company has to take care of their economic responsibilities, maximizing profits and minimizing losses. They also have to take care of legal responsibilities, laws, regulations, standards, compliance, go figure, ethical responsibilities, and philanthropic responsibilities. So I want to talk about this in terms of the media coverage of the series of outbreaks attributed to Chipotle Mexican grill restaurants, 2015 to 2018. These were multiple outbreaks tied to multiple foodborne pathogens with multi-state public health impacts, sickening over 1,100 U.S. customers. There were also Canadian customers that were impacted by this as well. But here's where it kind of gets interesting in terms of newspaper coverage. There's examples of newspaper coverage where the headline indicates that the news outlet was focusing on economics. Chipotle on Wall Street, their recovery is nearly complete. Looking at the company's stock. There are examples of headlines that look at legal, how they had to pay $25 million, the US's largest fine ever, in penalties for a foodborne outbreak. The largest fine ever imposed in a food safety case. There's some that focus on ethical. Chipotle's leadership has a significant trust problem. And philanthropic. Oh, look, Chipotle invests in do-good startups. So if you were trying to determine if Chipotle was a good place to eat and you were looking at these headlines, well, okay, there's a ethical issue, there's some legal issues, there's some economic issues, but the philanthropic feel-good article from 2018 puts a different spin on things. They invest in do-good startups. So let's compare that, though, with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We have physiological needs: air, water, sleep, food, shelter. Safety and security, personal and financial, health and well-being. Social needs: friendship and family. Esteem, like self-esteem, confidence, achievement. And we have self-actualization, creativity, realization of potential. So again, from the same exact period of time, focusing on Chipotle, let's look at the different kinds of headlines we can find. First off, we have those physiological needs. Chipotle faces another foodborne illness outbreak, this time in Boston. Chipotle shutters dozens of locations as more confirmed E. coli cases emerge. We have safety and security. Chipotle sales decline, causes layoffs, right? This impacts your financial security. They temporarily closed 43 locations. We can also find social needs. This is from Chipotle's own website. Chipotle brings families together for free kids' meals on Sundays in the middle of all these outbreaks. Esteem, New York Times, Chipotle has a plan to pay tuition. Will it actually help? And self-actualization. Chipotle career path, the journey to restaurateur. So it's just amazing how you can look at how a company can have so many headlines, and these are just some specific, random examples, I mean, where during the same period of time, the journalists can frame their entire story and the headline based on these different issues, whether we're looking at these different responsibilities on the left or even these different human needs on the right. But as we look at these, we kind of can note a bit of a interesting correlation. It's not exactly as if the economic responsibilities on the left would take care of the physiological needs on the right. Perhaps it's the opposite. It's not until a company is focusing on the philanthropic responsibilities and even the ethical responsibilities that they would start to focus on the physiological needs, the safety and security needs, and other needs on the right. But there's one thing to consider. I've looked at this in terms of consumer, realize that we're all consumers, even those people who work for or within the food industry. So if a company is not taking care of the physiological or the safety and security needs of its employees, how can those employees focus on ensuring the safety and security needs of the consumers? Just a question to ponder there. A couple other things to note is that the personal news cycle, it was a study that came out in 2014 that showed about 4 in 10 American surveyed actually delve deeper into a particular news subject beyond the headlines. Thus, in a non-read article, the headline is the only contributor to such action. Remember all those headlines I showed up here earlier? Imagine if you didn't read the article and this was the only thing that you saw. A lot more information beyond the headline of the article. Another 2 years later, another statement was made in terms of one research here that was published in Forbes. The headlines have become almost like articles in and of themselves. So we got to think about those headlines there. And I'm going to come back in terms of some takeaways in a little bit. If we look at modern media, we know that there's much more than just television and newspapers. Yes, we do have political cartoons like you see in the top left and the top right, but we also have viral memes. And very much like that t-shirt I saw in 1993, one could say, well, they're not really funny, but I like to think of this as a gauge, a measure, if you will, that this idea of general awareness, these wouldn't go viral. These wouldn't be funny, if you will. These wouldn't be shared unless it was understood, unless people knew what E. coli was, unless people knew what salmonella was, unless people were talking about or had food poisoning on their mind. They knew about Bluebell ice cream. They knew about Chipotle. And yes, even today, all these years later, you can still find T-shirts on sale that's like you saw with the Jack-in-the-Box shirt that focus on this. In this case, I survived E. coli. It's a registered trademark, and someone's selling this shirt out there. We also know that not only on our computers, but even in the palm of our hand on our phones, we have access to web pages, to Twitter, to Facebook, to so many different sources of information where people could be going and looking for information. People can be looking up very specific questions to help them. They could be looking up things for their home, things for their business, even things for their career path that are out there. In some cases, like you see at the very bottom there, the Washington State Department of Health is actually communicating out to people. And at the top right, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is communicating out to people about things they need to take a look at. We can also look at Yelp, for instance. The idea that There's more things to there. And with social media, what and who gets read on Twitter. Here's a report. I thought this was an interesting take on the transition between journalism and what's on social media, because news has influenced. News is influenced and becomes influential, supporting the idea that public opinion related to politics, even natural disasters, is influenced by editorial decisions and the source of the information. I can't tell you how many times every month I am quoted, I'm involved in articles. And what I'll find after the fact is that many times the article is published by the newspaper or by the magazine and then picked up and turned into bits and pieces on social media. And it really is like this trickle down, watering down of the information. The less accurate, the less detailed information in the original source, or how they frame that original source, will end up influencing how it is read on Twitter or LinkedIn or any social media there. So understanding social media, we got to understand that they are not all the same. We have the general public who will just go to look at something for information. We have fewer people who will become a friend, a fan, a follower of a website. Even fewer will actually subscribe. Some may become prospects. Fewer will become customers and members, loyalists and advocates. And this really kind of spells out, are people just looking? Are they following information? Are they subscribing and will get notified of when there's new details, there's new articles? Are they going to connect with other experts, local or national or worldwide, on the topic? Are they going to literally become like a card carrying member, like some retail establishments, and they get their information from that grocery store's webpage as well as when they are at the store? Will they become loyalists who avid they're avid followers of something? And we've seen this with sports. Down the States, we saw this with Bluebell ice cream. There are people like, I don't care. Even with Chipotle, I don't care. Chipotle's too good. I'll do whatever they say, kind of a thing. Or do they become advocates? Will they turn around and share this information on their own platforms, their own social media, their own followers? In education, we kind of look at this in terms of the top the top level there of the funnel being people who are passive. They're just going to come by it or not. The middle being people who are active, and that translating to the very fewer element there in terms of generative. These are people who would generate new ideas. They'll generate new messages. They'll generate revenue even, up for themselves or for a company based on how they are engaging with social media. We can definitely see how some social media fits into the top three categories there. You can be you'll find it or you're not, you're just looking, or you could become a friend, a fan, a follower, a subscriber. But we can also look at some examples like Amazon, people buying on Amazon. There's a company called iwaspoisoned.com and even Yelp. iwaspoisoned.com is a crowdsourcing data collection information website where people can log on and give a very different kind of review. You're giving a review that you got sick. Where did you eat? What did you eat? What was your symptoms? Things like that, and you can report it. And it is this collection. If enough people report the same thing from the same place, it can show a trend. And it was this trend that initially exposed that Chipotle Mexican grill outbreak in 2015. The local media became aware of this trend that was happening with that data. And this is not a fluke. In 2014, the CDC published in their Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report an article showing how online reviews by restaurant patrons identified unreported cases of foodborne illnesses in New York City. The idea that only 3% of the qualified reviews, those that were really about this issue, were actually reported directly to the New York Department of Health. And this research, in the process of doing this research, they actually identified illnesses that met their outbreak investigation criteria, and they identified previously unreported outbreaks. The ultimate finding is that the results suggest that online restaurant reviews might help identify unreported outbreaks of foodborne illness in restaurants with deficiencies in food handling. Even just recently, though, in Food Safety News, this incredible article, again, it's only from February 10th of this month, of this year, looking at how researchers are using iwaspoisoned.com and Amazon reviews to improve food data. To improve food safety through the data mining and data analytics of information that's found on these sources. So again, crowdsourcing information is now being looked at in terms of a way that people are communicating through social media, not only to find out information very passively, but to generate data that can be used by health officials to help find information that might bring about better food safety. And here's where we would see these, be customers, loyalists, and even acting as advocates for others in terms of what they're doing. So we got to look at this role of social media. Before social media, you saw the kind of jagged red curve there, where a lot of change. Yes, there were companies who would take an opportunity to make change immediately with incidents and crises. Um, um, but there's others that above the dotted line there that don't bring about change after its public attention until there's been changes in legislation or litigation or even regulation and oversight. Court cases was responsible for a major bump in an increase in companies taking actions to change what was the problem. But today, this newer curve shows that social media, the role of not only communicating food safety issues, making people aware about it, but even of people, acting as an advocate, acting as a supporter of data, helping investigators, helping companies find where the problems are. And this just increases the options in terms of finding out and solving these problems. While the earlier that we can make these changes and bring about the end of an outbreak, it reduces the amount of liabilities when you look at the length of time that's taken place after an event becomes public. So again, the idea that the things described by Mr. Sinclair happened yesterday are happening today and tomorrow and the next day until some Hercules comes to cleanse the filthy stable. I think that that's what we need to look at in terms of not a Hercules, but Herculean effort. The amount of Herculean effort that's needed in terms of food safety being an enormous amount of work, strength, and courage. Media, social media, television, newspapers, etc., is not meant to take the place of, but they can definitely add to the strength of our voices, the strengths of our networks, and increase the efficiency of the work that we do when it comes to food safety. So, in looking at this, I have 5 key takeaways. One is providing, in terms of social media and print and broadcast journalism, providing them with clear and complete details as much as you can provide. Appealing to multiple story frames, and I'll explain this in a minute. Building media partners, followers, and subscribers, kind of like that funnel I was talking about before. Persistent efforts, and engaging public via multiple platforms. So let's dig into these really briefly as we wrap up here. One, we need to remember that facts matter, science matters, and that clarity and transparency can save lives. When we have a lack of transparency, when we have a lack of traceability, this only complicates investigations and tracebacks and outbreak resolution and recall efforts. Appealing to multiple story frames. Looking at an issue and talking about it purely as scientific or unfortunately purely as a public health issue is not necessarily going to get the attention of all media sources. We need to think about it in terms of how can we frame this for economics? How can we make an economic argument that a company needs to make change? The legal considerations, ethics, and of course, safety, family, and community. Building media partners, followers, and subscribers, like that funnel again. I work with some incredible companies that not only include different partners, but will even train journalists. They'll put out special events for journalists and social media voices and non-government organizations that help them improve their messaging and their voices. Uh, Persistent efforts need to look beyond TV and print journalism, timelines and deadlines. It used to be that everything had to be ready for the 5 o'clock news, the 11 o'clock news. And today it's very different, but there are still many deadlines. I work with a lot of reporters that are always like, I have to have this done by 1 o'clock Eastern today. I need this, so it can get through the cycle, and how important it is to respond to them with as much information right away. And then the idea of, it's one thing to have a media contact. It's another thing to have someone who's being generative, looking at social media, looking at Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, different platforms to engage with the public and get messages out. And I think that this is one of those things. Communicating today is a lot different than it was 25 years ago. And we need to be very aware of not only the platforms, but what it takes to really build that strength in these different ways. Again, food safety requires a Herculean effort, an enormous amount of work, strength, and courage. And part of that is the effort that we put into leading, educating, inspiring, and advocating for change. And this is some of the things that need to come along with not just the facts, not just the science, but how we communicate that can be construed as truly educating and inspiring and advocating for those changes and behaviors that we truly want to get out of what we are communicating, and trying to help companies improve their brand, their reputation, and the trust in them. At the same time, look out for the safety when it comes to public health. And with that, I thank you. I apologize for the bit of delay in me getting this started, but I'm happy to spend whatever time we can answering any questions.
Well, I do have to comment. I kind of laughed when you asked me that question about the reporters and them going on site or reporting on some of these food facilities. And I am one of those food safety professionals that likes to play spot the GMP violation when they have guest features at local food facilities, or even ones across Canada or the US. So I find it hard to watch sometimes. And I think it's really important for food companies to always advocate the proper way they're doing things and showing how they do things, and educate the reporters that yes, the hairnet's required to take off your jewelry. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I remember seeing a video many years ago. It was great. Oh wow, this news show is going into a restaurant to look at how we do food safety practices, and they're you see the worker there doing his or her thing, and wearing the hairnet and wearing the gloves and using a thermometer. Meanwhile, the host is talking to the owner of the restaurant, who's like drinking his coffee, unlidded, next to the salad prep, and I'm like, oh my god, there's a violation.
Yeah, there's a violation. Spot the violation. Yeah, it's entertaining and saddening at the same time sometimes.
Yeah.
I do have a couple of questions here.
Great.
And, actually a nice comment here. I'll read it for you so you could get the context of it. It said, thank you again for an excellent presentation. Very well done and appreciated. Interested on your further thoughts pertaining to the slides about cooking ground beef until it's brown. For background, as you may know, in Canada, at least in my experience, restaurants rarely, if ever, provide a cooking option medium rare to the customer. I can validate that. They definitely don't normally give you an option. It's always well done. When ordering a hamburger at retail, there is specific minimum cook to temperature listed on the ground beef packages. I think it's like 165 to 74, he says, which I believe is correct. This is in contrast to restaurants where I visit in the US, as well as, for example, ground beef packaging which I would think would argue doesn't provide much guidance in terms of biological food safety hazard. So kind of would like you to provide a little bit more context on that.
Sure. Well, first off, that postcard was from 1993 or 1994. I'm sorry, it was from 1994. And there was a lot of pushback in terms of what if we put the wrong information on there, and the industry was saying don't put too much information there. And so at the time, um, 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 looked at the idea of, well, something is better than nothing. A couple other things too. You're right about in the U.S. There is a restaurant, or at least there was up until recently, called Bar 145. The idea that a hamburger should never be cooked above 145 degrees, otherwise it ruins it. There's this weird association with the idea of being American and being a macho man. The more the rarer, the less cooked it is, the more American or the more masculine you are. There's some studies going back to looking at how there was this whole campaign, beef, it's what's for dinner, and the idea of American and beef and all that kind of stuff. I even went to a restaurant probably 5 or 6 years ago, ordered a well done hamburger, and it was so red in the middle. And I took it back to the counter and said, this is not cooked enough. And the guy at the counter goes, oh, wow, that is really not cooked enough. And I asked the guy, well, who's in charge here? Who's your person in charge? And this guy comes out and he goes, hi, I'm so-and-so. How can I help you? And I showed him this, and he says, oh, I don't know what happened there. And I asked him, do you use thermometers? And his response was, sir, we cook about 500 to 600 hamburgers a day. We don't need to use thermometers. We can tell. Well, obviously, it didn't work this time.
Yeah.
And so a lot of battling ideas and thoughts and cultural elements going on there. So taking into consideration, it still is an issue today that cook until it's brown in the middle is not complete, but it was thought to be a message at the time. I don't think we would see that message today because I've actually done science experiments with cooking to show that you can't tell how much it's done based on the color inside. So great question there.
All right, the next question is, what are your thoughts on iwaspoisoned.com? I ask this because many pathogenic bacteria take time before you notice infection. Some take days or even many hours. With this being said, when you look up iwaspoisoned.com, you see everyone blaming the place that ate a few hours before. Do you think they might be blaming the wrong restaurant or the food for the sickness?
This is something that's definitely come up, and it's one of those things where taken each individual reporting, if you will, on its own is not what needs to be looked at. It's that trend. If you see enough people are saying that they saw bad conditions or that they got sick from there, that is what could prompt the local health department to go take a look at it. That's what happened with Chipotle. So it's not so much the individual report, it's the trend. And even that, it's just one part of the investigation. It's one part of the awareness, if you will. No one would necessarily give that place a second look unless there were a lot of people reporting about that. So I agree, it's like, how can you get sick from something when it has let's say it could be like a 9-day incubation period. It could be days later. It could be from person to person contact. It doesn't mean you have to have eaten it there. But when you look at enough reports, if that kind of gives a heads up in terms of something needs to be looked at, then I do think that is one source for us to investigate.
All right, I think that's the end of our questions for today. I want to thank everybody for attending, and especially Dr. Detwiler for presenting the last three. Great feedback on all 3 sessions, and I'm sure we'll have you back again.
Great, I look forward to it.
All right, awesome. I'll see you guys later.
Thank you very much. Stay safe.
Yes, you too now.